I want to welcome everyone to the Women's Club. I'm Merle Wilberding, and I'm introducing you and appreciate the chance to welcome you to the Women's Club for this evening's program. I think it's going to be a wonderful evening, and we especially like to share the opportunity to spend this program at the Women's Club. For those who aren't familiar with the Women's Club and this building was built in the 1840s, and it was built by Robert Steele, who was then on the Board of Education for the city of Dayton for many, many years, and many of the local people will recognize Robert Steele as being the namesake for the old Steele High School, which was just a block across. So this was his home that he built in the 1840s, and in 1916, the Dayton Women's Club was organized, and it's interesting because when they organized it, the purposes for which they created this facility was for social, civic, and literary activities. And I think it's perfectly appropriate that we have a premier literary activity tonight at the Women's Club. And in recent years, of course, the Women's Club has opened up the membership, and I and our law firm Coolidge Wall are members of it, so we appreciate the opportunity to share the club with everyone. And tonight we're going to have a wonderful opportunity to meet the winning authors, and I am going to yield the moderator's position to Bob Fogarty, the editor of the Antioch Review. Bob?
Thank you, Merle. As everybody knows, this is the time of year in Ohio and all of the Midwest where there are street fairs. That south of us, there is the famous Sauerkraut Festival going on. And in Yellow Springs, they have a very inventive weekend, which they call the Falling of the Leaves, which is about as banal a title as one could find, actually, to describe a weekend. It's hard for the leaves not to fall, actually. It's one of the things they do. So this particular activity is in the tradition of fall activities in central Ohio and southern Ohio. I want to say just a few words about the judging process because it's an important piece of the awarding of the prize. We have 23 local readers who vetted the books, made precise rankings of them, and then finalists were chosen from those that were submitted. And then we had outside, as it were, judges. In this particular case, for the second year in the area of nonfiction, we had Alan Chews, who is the NPR book critic, and Amy Hempel, who is a distinguished short story writer and has joined us for the first time. In the categories of nonfiction, we had Jane McCafferty and C.M. Mayo, both of whom published widely. They're both accomplished authors. And there was a general agreement among the judges as to who should get the awards. And so we've been pleased with the judging process. We try to keep it as open, and we will rotate judges off the panel so that there is not the infamous log rolling, which of course is well known in the literary world and known in other worlds also. This is in many ways the most intimate event that occurs in the course of the events. There is no emphasis on celebrities. We're simply dealing with authors, and we get an opportunity, in fact, to hear them read from their own work or talk about their own work. We'll go in the following order. Our nonfiction, our fiction winner, Brad Kessler, will read from his work, and then Lisa Fugard will read from her work. And finally, Mark Kulansky, who we thought might be delayed at the airport, was not, fortunately. Failed to be, right, failed to be. So we have accommodated his failure to do that by leaving him where he was on the initial program. So without ado, let me introduce Brad Kessler, our fiction award winner. Please.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Mark pointed out that my parents are here, so I better watch what I say. So I'm not going to read the racy parts. I'm going to read from Birds and Fall, and for those of you who don't know, it's about a plane crash that takes place off the coast of Nova Scotia, and most of the action takes place at a small inn on an island off the coast, where the families of the victims gather in the days following the crash. And there's a pretty large cast of characters. There's a Bulgarian man, there's a Iranian American man, there's a Taiwanese woman, and one of the people to come there is an ornithologist. That's me. Can you she has a 4-year-old son, so she's allowed. Oh, it's the one with the 7-year-old dog, who's missing his sister's wedding to be here.
Tell everyone.
His sister is very upset with him, and that's probably her just calling to create havoc. Mark, you bum. Look at that. So the families gather there, and one of the characters whose husband has died in a plane crash is an ornithologist named Anna Gathrow. And the part that I'm going to read is towards page 46. It's near the beginning of the book. And it's just as Anna is taken to her cottage at this bed and breakfast by the sea. And she's just come, the innkeeper has just brought her there. And the rest is pretty self-explanatory. Anna Gathrow didn't watch him go. Neither did she hear the last thing he said. When the door shut, she let out a long, weary exhalation and sat tentatively on the edge of the bed. The ocean seethed outside. She could hear it through the closed windows. Her head ached. Her jeans were damp. She shut her eyes and pressed the throbbing in the side of her head. The last few days had been a total blur. The phone calls back and forth to the airline officials, the counselors, her mother-in-law in England, her brother, the chartered flight from Kennedy. In the Halifax airport, the other family members had stood in circles in the frigid sunlight, arms draped around each other, but Anna had insisted on coming alone. There were white roses in the hotel room in Halifax, baskets of cellophaned fruit. In a ballroom with maroon curtains, the rescue officials cited statistics. The temperature of the waters off Nova Scotia that time of year, 65 degrees. How long an adult male could survive out there, 36 hours. How long a female, more body fat, more hours. Anna took notes. It was the only thing she knew how to do, jotting numbers, initials, anagrams on a piece of hotel stationery, as if she were in graduate school again. She wrote SAR, CTSB, VDR, LKP, without knowing what half of them meant. The one that stuck in mind was LKP. She repeated it over and over to herself like a mantra that first day in Nova Scotia. LKP, last known position. What was Russell's last known position? What was hers? What was theirs the afternoon before he left? The first night in Halifax, she didn't sleep. She wanted desperately to get to the ocean. She could almost feel its pull. She wanted to be closer to Russell, for it seemed possible then, despite all evidence otherwise, that he might somehow still be alive. They'd called off the search and rescue only that morning, but Russell was a good swimmer. He was fit, clever, and had traveled all over Asia collecting bird species. Might not he somehow have survived? In the field, Anna had wired her savanna sparrows with tiny radio transmitters to chart their movement after breeding. She'd lost individual birds for days on end, the signals disappearing, until one day she heard the blips on the radio once more. Couldn't that happen as well with her husband? Just when she thought he was gone for good? She'd requested right away to go to the nearest place to the crash. The Red Cross people had made arrangements. Other family members were going to Traitches too, but it took another full day before she was finally driven out of Halifax. The limousine driver kept the little window open between them just in case. Outside, the world slipped by without sound. Green hills, white gas stations, rain on the blacktop. She woke to sunlight through tinted glass, liquor bottles strapped in place with belts. On the ferry, she staggered up to the deck and set her face to the wind. It was afternoon by then. She stood in the back of the boat beside the rail and wept, while Arctic terns forked overhead and a large woman with a cane appeared out of nowhere, placed a hand on her elbow and embraced her. When the Trachus light swung into view, silent, minatory, she wondered, was this what Russell last saw? A beacon, a green flame, a candle? Was this his last known position? On Trachus, all the houses had colored ribbons tied to the trees and hand-painted signs constructed by children, it seemed, of broken hearts with supportive sentiments. She refused to read them after the first 5. In the dimming light, they passed marshes, spruce forests, iron-red mud flats, and then they arrived at the high-peaked inn on a bluff, yellow-painted, Gothic, with graveled lanes leading to cottages half hidden in the wood. For days, Anna had been surrounded by others, and all she'd wanted was to be alone, closer to Russell, by the water's edge, to have a moment of stillness near him. But now, sitting on the bed in the darkened cottage, with the door closed and the innkeeper gone, she felt utterly, acutely alone. The day was ending outside, the ocean folding in on itself, like her life, she thought, like linen, folded up and packed away. It was exactly 120 hours now since the crash. She'd been keeping track. This is why she came here, she reflected, to see the ocean, the wreckage, to see more pointedly what wasn't visible. Tomorrow they'd go to the tip of the island nearest the place where the plane went down. She stood and unzippered her knapsack. She'd brought hardly any clothing, just a long print dress. She was still wearing the same sweater, the same Levi's, the same bra she'd worn since leaving New York City. Somehow to change her clothes, to shower, even to eat, seemed a kind of betrayal, an acceptance. And if she could only ignore the exigencies of her own body, she might outwit the deadly hours that kept slipping past. She removed a toilet bag from the pack and emptied it on the chenille, a toothbrush, a comb, the Valium Yvonne had given her, the sleeping pills, Halcyon, a tube of deodorant. She removed Russell's wrinkled T-shirt from her pack. She'd taken it from the laundry bag unwashed and had carried the pocket tee with her on the plane as a pillow and slept with it wrapped around her head at night. Russell once told her that Elizabethan women kept apples tucked in their armpits and gave them afterwards to their lovers. The T-shirt was something like that, her own private apple. She removed last a Ziploc bag from the side pocket of the knapsack. Sometime that first day back in New York City, Yvonne had come onto the rooftop and put a hand on Anna's shoulder and said, matter-of-factly, because there was no other way to say it, "They want some of Russell's hair." Yvonne didn't have to explain. Russell analyzed DNA all the time in his systematics lab. He studied the evolution of bird species by examining their genetic sequences. He'd often talked about the transformation of a species over time, how one molecule of guanine or cytosine could create a totally different bird, a slow-motion metamorphosis. He gathered study skins, preserved birds, from around the world, both for the museum collection and for his own study of their nuclear DNA, so Anna knew all too well about the hair. She opened the Ziploc, removed a maple hairbrush and set it in her lap. That morning in New York City, she'd searched the loft in a fit of growing hysteria, collecting every strand of hair she found on the bed, the mattress, the pillow, the bathroom floor, not sure if any of them was his or hers or someone else's. Finally, Yvonne forced her to stop. It turned out Russell's own hairbrush was sitting right on top of the toilet. At the Halifax airport, Anna had handed the brush to one of the Red Cross volunteers, and he'd taken it so gently, so reverentially, she almost inexplicably laughed. They'd given the brush back to her earlier that day, and now in the cottage on Traches Island, she brought the soft boar hairs to her face. They smelled faintly of Russell's aftershave, Penhaligon's they'd probably rubbed off from his toilet bag. She left the brush on the bed and went to the sliding glass doors again. The rain had stopped outside. The ocean roared. Wind chimes tinkled somewhere in the dusk. For a moment, a bit of clear sky broke overhead, and the room filled with a muted amber light. The ocean turned molten. It seemed to Anna just then, standing before the glass, that she'd been waiting her whole life to be in that room at that hour, alone, beside the sea. She slid open the glass door. The air smelled of low tide. She heard the hoarse chatter of a kingfisher overhead. It sounded as it always did, like a bird who'd lost its voice and was left with only a rattle, an unlovely staccato, harsh and insistent. It called again from a nearby tree, paused, rattled once more. Had Anna looked above the deck into the spruce, she might have seen it, a belted kingfisher, megasurreal Alcyon. What was the story Russell told her once about the kingfishers? She couldn't recall just then, but her breath quickened anyhow. The hairs on her arms stood on end. She opened the door wider and stepped outside. She was going down to the beach. Thank you.
I just lost my place. Yikes. No, hold on a second. It's my book. I know where it is. I have got it. Okay. Skinner's Drift is set in South Africa in the 1980s, and it takes place primarily on a farm on the banks of the Limpopo River. The farm's name is Skinner's Drift. And sort of central to the novel is this relationship between Martin van Rensburg, a white farmer, his daughter Eva, and Lefu, a African man who works on the farm. And the novel unfolds through the various points of views of those three characters and others. And the section that I'm going to read right now is from Lefu's point of view, the African man. And in South Africa, oftentimes blacks would have two names. They would be their sort of the African name. His is Lefu, and then because, for heaven's sake, you couldn't ask a white person to ever, wrap their mouths around an African name, they would also have a white world name, and his name is Ezekiel. So when you hear him being referred to as Ezekiel, it's the same character. Lefu slept fitfully until the hour before dawn, when Lady's sharp bark woke him. He sat up in his narrow bed and listened. Someone was softly calling his name. He left the bed, lifted the sacking stretched across the small window, and saw Lucky and Lady wagging their tails in the middle of the tamped-down dirt clearing in front of the old stables. Again, he heard his name. He pulled on a pair of old trousers and a shirt, stepped into his shoes, and quietly opened the door. The moonlit shadow of the old leadwood tree spilled toward him. Beneath the tree stood a ghostly horse with someone astride it. "Ezekiel," a small voice whispered, "I want you to come riding with me." It sounded like Eva, but she was asleep in the farmhouse, and even if she wasn't, she would not be near the old stables at this hour, and she would certainly never ask him to ride. Her father forbade it. Martin van Rensburg did not want a black man sitting on any of his horses. A snuffling sound rippled into the night, and the horse tossed his head in greeting. It was Eva and Casper. She beckoned him, and he moved through the night air until he reached the warm breath of the horse. Eva was riding bareback, and what she said astonished him. "I will give you money if you will ride into the bush with me and do me a favor." "Miss Eva, I cannot," Lefu whispered. "You know I'm not allowed to ride, and soon, very soon, I must feed the horses, clean the stables. The boss will be very angry if I am late. I have cleaned the stables, and my father will not know. He is drunk. I will give you 10 rand. As if she was certain that this amount of money had settled it, and Lefu would follow her, Eva tugged on the halter and urged the horse back towards the stable. And Lefu did. He found himself walking up the familiar footpath that each morning led his family back into the lives of the Van Rensburgs, his feet knowing just when to step over the knotted roots of the strangler fig, his hand reaching out to brush the leaves of his dying mealies. Eva had lit a lamp at the stables, and in the corner of the concrete floor he saw the wheelbarrow filled with soiled wood shavings. She slid off Casper, hurried into the tack room, and returned with a saddle and bridle that she handed to Lefu, saying, "Ride Donder." Bewildered, he stood there, not moving. "Hurry," Eva urged, and she opened the stable door and motioned for him to enter. Donder butted his head against Lefu's chest, and he slipped the bit into the horse's soft, moist mouth, eased the saddle onto his back, and tightened the girth. "Let's go," Eva said, and she nudged Casper up the footpath. So many times Lefu had led the large, dark brown horse outside for Martin to ride. Now, as if in a dream, he put his foot in the stirrup and hiked himself up. Donder shuddered into a generous trot, and Lefu jostled in the saddle and gripped the horse's mane in terror. Perhaps Martin was not so drunk that he couldn't drive across the farm to search for his wayward daughter. If he saw a black man riding his horse at 5 a.m, he would shoot him. No questions asked. Half a mile down the dirt road, Eva veered onto a footpath snaking through the bush, and Lefu, still gripping Donder's mane, followed right behind her. He felt powerless to turn back, even to voice his fears. He was at Eva's mercy, and he was disoriented. The paths that he knew so well on foot looked different from astride a horse. He bounced in the saddle, briefly touching the rhythm, touching it again, until suddenly he had slipped into it. A surging river of horse, and it felt familiar, easy, the way it had been when he was a youngster, pinching rides on the donkeys around the kraals, on sad, sway-backed horses that he pushed into ragged trots. The massive border fence loomed ahead. Eva urged Casper into a canter and turned onto the dirt track running parallel to the border. Lefu pressed his fists into Donder's neck, feeling the animal's warmth and sweat, its muscular legs eating up the earth. Faster and faster they rode, until there was no separation between Lefu and Donder and the acres of land called Skinner's Drift. Somewhere, far behind, he slipped free of his tired, aching body and the sadnesses his heart had accumulated. "Naledi," he gasped when she finally reined in. He looked at her in a way that he would never look at her again. There was no past between them, no hint of their future, just a black man and a white girl who had shared an exhilarating ride together. For the briefest moment, Eva was radiant. "You ride well." Then her eyes flickered away from Lefu. He followed her gaze. In the long grass, beneath the blackened branches of a tree that had been struck by lightning 2 years ago, lay a tawny-colored caracal, a cat a little larger than a jackal, with tufts of long black hair on the tips of its ears. Dark clots of blood on its flank marked where several bullets had entered its body. Eva dismounted and squatted next to the animal, her hands hovering over it. "We need to take it back to the dam." She opened the leather saddlebag slung in front of Casper's saddle, retrieved a rope and a large piece of sacking, and handed them to Lefu. He was baffled as to why she wanted the animal's body, but having been taught never to question a white person, he didn't ask her, and he wrapped the caracal in the sacking. Eva stood a few feet away, watching him, the expression on her face one of sorrowful uncertainty. Lefu tried to lay the animal across Donder's back, but the horse snorted and shied away. "It's the blood. He does not like the smell, Naledi." "He must do it." Lefu tried again, and with some coaxing he managed to tie the bundle behind the saddle. No sooner was he astride Donder than Eva said, "There are more." She trotted along the rutted track in the direction of the sandstone cliffs until she reached a cluster of fragrant water acacias. Beneath them, Lefu saw 2 jackals, and like the one he had buried several days ago, these animals had been shot numerous times. Eva took 2 more sacks out of her saddlebags, and he bundled the jackals into them, tying one onto Donder and the other onto Casper, who was quieter and didn't flinch. In the dawn light, they cantered for most of their return, a circuitous route that took them far away from the kraals of the other workers. They reined in when they reached the clearing alongside the empty dam, where just a few days ago Eva had asked him to bury the first jackal. I hid a spade near the last row of tomato plants. Bury them. Lefu dismounted and quickly untied the 3 bundles. Hurry, Eva urged, and she trotted back to the stables, leading Donder by the reins. It was almost 6 o'clock, and already the sun felt too hot. Beyond the tomato fields, Lefu saw the dust and thirst of the land. He sank to his knees, horrified by what he had just done. A hyena standing on its hind legs, walking into the big house and pouring itself a drink, was no more of an aberration than Lefu galloping across Martin van Rensburg's farm on Martin van Rensburg's horse. With the drumbeat of hooves still reverberating in his body, he pressed his forehead to the earth and begged God's forgiveness. Flies were already gathering on the 3 sacks, and he found the spade, walked 10 paces from where he had buried the first jackal, and began to dig. 2 feet deep, and the earth was bone dry. The movement quieted his heart. Just dig, just work, he kept telling himself. Eva reappeared on Casper as he was shoveling earth on the caracal. In a businesslike fashion, she gave him the 10-rand note. "You know, my father is shooting these animals," she said, before she rode away.
It's always funny to talk about nonfiction after fiction. You feel sort of crass and far less subtle, you know. And to make it worse, I'm going to largely talk. I'm going to read just a little bit. I've written about a dozen books. I've somehow lost count, but it's something like that. And in all of these books, ones that sold very well and ones that didn't sell as well, I've always been amazed at the way my readers liked the books in a weird way, you know, like they liked me, and which, you know, is supposed to be nice, but it always sort of troubled me. I always thought, you know, that's not who an author is supposed to be. So now I've done it. I've written a book that some people really like and other people really don't, which is the way it should be. Although I'm amazed at how angry people can become when you speak against war. I didn't write the book to make people angry. I wrote the book because it's an idea that I'm passionate about, because I have seen 3 generations of Americans deeply damaged by violence that didn't have to be. And it seems to me that we can come to a point in civilization where this madness stops. And in order to arrive at that point, we have to face truths that are seldom talked about. So I went back into history, and I didn't discover things that were unknown. These are all things that are in the record, but somehow never get put together and rarely get talked about. It's very important how we teach history. I just want to read this one passage. This isn't from me, this is a quote.
To kill one man is to be guilty of a capital crime. To kill 10 men is to increase the guilt tenfold. To kill 100 men is to increase it 100-fold. This the rulers of the earth all recognize, and yet, when it comes to the greatest crime, waging war on another state, they praise it. It is clear they do not know it is wrong, for they record such deeds to be handed down to posterity. If they knew they were wrong, why should they wish to record them and have them handed down to posterity? If a man, on seeing a little black, were to say it is black, but on seeing a lot of black were to say it is white, it would be clear that such a man could not distinguish black and white. Or, if he were to taste a few bitter things, were to pronounce them sweet, clearly he would be incapable of distinguishing between sweetness and bitterness. So those who recognize a small crime as such, but do not recognize the wickedness of the greatest crime of all, the waging of war on another state, but actually praise it, cannot distinguish right and wrong. So as to right or wrong, the rulers of the world are in confusion. That was written by a man named Mozi in China around 400 BC. These are not new ideas. These are not ideas that were invented by Gandhi. They're not ideas that came about in the 60s. As long as human beings have talked about developing civilizations, it has been apparent to a lot of people that in a civilized society, you shouldn't be killing other people. And as long as there has been war, there have been people saying, what are we doing? My God, this is wrong. I start this book with the interesting fact that there's no word for nonviolence. I speak a number of languages, including, oddly enough, Basque, and none of the languages that I speak is there a word for nonviolence. I asked Asian language experts and Slavic language experts and Native American language experts and African language experts, and as far as I can find, there is no language that has a word for nonviolence. I mean, nonviolence is not a word. It's the negation of the word violence. Gandhi invented a word because there wasn't one. What does that tell you? I mean, what would it tell you? What would it tell you if there were no language in the world that had a word for violence, but there was a word for nonviolence, and the only way to say violence was this other word? That would be a world in which nonviolence was the common and normal way to act, and violence was an aberration. Clearly, we live in the opposite kind of world. This is not to say that we are warlike creatures and we always have to go to war. Anybody who has ever been in combat, I have been in combat as a journalist. I have not been in combat as a combatant. In fact, refused to. But I have known many people in combat in numerous wars. Anybody who has been in combat can tell you that war is not a natural thing, that it goes against human instincts. And the suffering of combat veterans is very directly connected to the fact that they feel they have done things that are against the laws of nature, against what human beings are about. That is because wars are not about what we're told they're about. Wars are about power. After the war or during the war or whenever it becomes necessary to get support for the war, myths are developed for the purpose of selling the war. I'll give you a few American examples. The American Revolution. The American Revolution fascinates me because when you look at the American Revolution, which is taught, well, I don't know, I went to school in New England. In New England, when you go to school, you're taught a lot about the American Revolution. It's a favorite war in New England. And it occurred to me one day that all of the really famous things about the American Revolution, like the Boston Tea Party, were nonviolent. And that, in fact, the whole American Revolution started as a campaign of nonviolence. John Adams, in his old age, in a letter, said, we really won the whole thing by 1774. 1774 was the year of a campaign of non-cooperation where they refused to recognize British judges in courts. And so stuck to that the British could no longer govern the colonies. And John Adams said, you know, from that time on, we had it. We had our independence. So then you think, so why did they go to war? There were many people at the time who asked that question. There was a man named John Dickinson from Pennsylvania. His wife was a Quaker, you know, so it said, oh, his wife was a Quaker. He didn't think we should go to war. And he refused to sign the Declaration of Independence. The standing of John Dickinson was brought home to me when I was writing an article about this in the LA Times, and a reader wrote in and said, well, you know, John Dickinson was a notorious traitor and a Tory. And the LA Times, in this very sort of journalistic way, called on me to either disprove it or they would have to run a letter of retraction. And I easily disproved it. But, you know, they had gotten their information from Wikipedia. You know, how could it be wrong? John Dickinson was at one time called the author of the Revolution. He wrote the Articles of Confederation. He wrote many pamphlets on independence. He was an ardent supporter of independence. He just didn't think that we had to kill to get it. Traitor. The Civil War, you know, the war to free the slaves. The only people who were really interested in freeing the slaves, aside from the slaves, were the abolitionists. Most of the abolitionists were dedicated nonviolent activists, people like William Lloyd Garrison. The one exception was John Brown, who was an extremely violent man. Who is the most famous abolitionist? John Brown. It was a movement that passionately believed that this thing could not be effectively accomplished through the violence and hatred that would be generated by a war. And they were right. The Union Army did not want to free slaves when they took over plantations. Lincoln was extremely reluctant to do the Emancipation Proclamation until so many people had died in the war that he thought it better be about something. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a very carefully worded thing. See, this is another thing about history, is that, you know, Abraham Lincoln was not this great idealist. He was a brilliant tactician. And the Emancipation Proclamation manages not to free anyone. The Emancipation Proclamation says that all black slaves are hereby free in areas that are controlled by the Confederate Army. The reason why he did that was he didn't want to free any slaves in the border states because he was afraid they'd throw in with the Confederacy. The war wasn't about freeing the slaves. And although they did become free in name only, they virtually had no rights in the South to the Civil Rights Movement, so that Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Monument in 1963, exactly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and said, someday not now. Someday we will say we are free at last. You find this in all wars. Now that enough time has gone by, it's widely believed that we had to go to war with Nazi Germany to save European Jewry. But the fact is that the Allies had absolutely no interest in saving European Jewry, and by the way, didn't do a very good job of saving them. All pleas by Jewish organizations to interfere with the Holocaust were rejected because this was not part of the war effort. World War II was about who's going to control the world. These are very unpleasant facts of history, but they're facts that we need to face because they're built on every time another war comes along. You know, we have to fight the Vietnamese to take a stand against communism so that it won't be like the Munich Pact. We have to stand up to Saddam Hussein because he has weapons of mass destruction, or was involved with Al Qaeda, or for whatever. The lies just get built on the lies, and we have to look at history, and we have to stop the lies, and we have to stop the killing, and we have to stop destroying our young people. And that's why I wrote this book. Thank you.
We have enough time to, if anyone wants to ask any questions or comments. Yes.
I heard what the last speaker was saying. The focus was on the things we have done. It's disturbing to me is it seems everybody turning the world in some of these things. Has it become more common than it used to be? It's happening part of the world that it's not happening.
I don't think it's become more common than it used to be, but weapons have become more effective than they used to be. The percentage of civilians who are killed in warfare is far higher than it used to be. It's gone up with every war. Now we're waging wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, basically against civilian populations. I think that the rejection of war is an idea that has taken hold of probably more people now than it ever has before. I think it's an idea that grows. We might not sense that living in this country because I don't know that it's an idea that has grown in this country. And you have to distinguish between people who are opposed to war and people who are opposed to a specific war. I think there's an overwhelming majority of people who are opposed, of Americans who are opposed to the Iraq War. But I'm not sure how many of those people are opposed to the concept of war. I think it grows, though. I think I was raised by the World War II generation, and when I opposed the Vietnam War, people in that generation found it to be a shocking and scandalous thing. I refused the draft. People, including my father, thought it was a shocking thing to do. I don't think that people are taken back by people who refuse to fight in Iraq today, possibly because their parents served the Vietnam generation. And I think that I think that these ideas are growing, possibly because warfare has just become so terrible. You know, there was a time before they figured out how to do it. There was a time when it looked like they weren't going to be able to do war anymore because they had nuclear weapons, and a war would be so terrible it would be unthinkable. And then they invented limited war. But I think that I actually see some hope in the Iraq War. The way so many people in the world, so many countries, most of the world just didn't buy into it, said this is wrong, and let's not do it. That hasn't happened that many times in history. So, you know, there are some glimmers of hope in the sad world.
It's the media. That's why I'm not so sure that more people are killing each other more often. You're seeing it. You're seeing it. I won't say I blame the media. Being a former media person, media covers twice.
Well, you know, that's probably a good thing. We're actually not seeing it as much as we did during the Vietnam.
No, but we're seeing all these, I call them sub-wars. There's such wars. But we're looking at genocide, war, we're looking and the media, Somalia, where the media is there. And this is something that, yes, Vietnam is kind of the beginning of this. This tense media. And you know what? You know, I'm not interested in saying lies of the health, but the media, I think, has shown us more, and maybe it is what's going on in the world. I mean, embedded reporters or whatever you want to call them, they're everywhere.
We need this. We need this because you know what
Then you know what a mess we're in.
in 1968 when Robert Kennedy made the decision to run for president, he said, if you think this war is wrong, you have a moral obligation to speak out against it because it's being done in your name. I think we should turn on the TV and see what's being done in our name.
I did.
We have in far back and then second and third.
Yeah, one of the things is, this war, the reason the Vietnam War had so many problems because we had a draft. And people from all walks of life were taken. Now, none of us in this room, unless we have a loved one or a relative in the war, are really connected with the war. We don't have rationing. We don't have a draft. We have a volunteer army. And I agree with Mr. Wrangler. If we had a draft, the war would be over with. Because notice, to see what was going on, there are more civilians killed in Iraq than our soldiers. The Iraqi people are taking the country.
Well, I have to admit, after spending a significant period of my lifetime opposing the draft, that I do now find myself thinking there are some arguments for it. I said that once. I was giving a talk at Yale, and I said that, and this woman said, "Oh, don't say that. I have 2 sons of military age." And I said, "Look, I'm not saying that I want to see your sons get drafted. I'm saying I want them to have the opportunity I had to refuse. It feels great."
Please.
I just wanted to comment on the fact that the media, we seem to forget, when those of us of a certain age, that during World War II, there was a lot in the newspapers, which was the only real media we had. It was headlines every day, arrows where the war was being fought, dead bodies, we had movies, The Tank, like Now Diary, a whole bunch of movies that brought this to our attention, our side of what was going on. We didn't have TV, but we had cafe news and others like that. So there was a lot in the media, which was only up until that point, the only available media. During the Polynesian Wars, they didn't have available media like that, so we didn't see more of that. But as we generate more media, television, iPods, everything, we see more.
But they didn't talk much about the horror of war. I mean, I grew up around traumatized World War II veterans.
Before the picture of the Japanese side with the sword over the man's head being decapitated, and other things like that.
A few things, but it was the exception. The raising of the
flag on Iwo Jima is the most remembered image of that battle, which was a horrific battle.
Yes, I had two questions for Lisa. I read in your biography that you've had experience acting, and I was curious to know if you had tried your hand at playwriting, and also to what extent your acting experience may have informed your novel writing process.
Well, I'll tell the playwriting question first. I wouldn't try my hand at it because I think that you really have to hear things to be a playwright. And I just, for me, writing is a very visual process. And I think the acting, I'm sure that it sort of, has, infused my life as a writer, though I think that probably what I do is pretty much what every writers that I certainly like to read, whose work I respect, do is, you sit down at a table, these characters show up, and then it's, the work of understanding, of asking why, because that's what I do. I ask why over and over and over again. And it's a pretty wonderful process, and particularly in Skinner's Drift, I have one character in here who's a stuttering, alcoholic Afrikaner farmer who's a pretty brutal man. And I can honestly say that, in the writing of the book, I ended up having a lot of compassion for that man because I had to sort of, I wanted to render him as fully as possible on the page. And so that why that I ask as a writer is then obviously something that I try to ask myself too, in my own life, why, and then it's, the next step is just to the other people that I encounter, why, and what makes you human.
Can I have a sort of follow-up comment? One of our local editorial writers several years ago, Martin Gottlieb, in the Dayton News, wrote I think a profound statement, which is reflected in your comments. He said, writing is not the act of putting down what you think, it's the act of figuring out what you think.
Yeah.
And your description was very much along those lines, whether it's you're writing nonfiction, and you still have things to figure out, or fiction, you have things to figure out. Thank you.
And the judgment, the easy judgments that you can make about a character, it's so fun to then go beyond those.
I think you have to handle it. Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry, I didn't know you saw. Yeah. I just want to know what prompted you to take on the plane crash and what kind of research you have done in the aftermath of the plane crash. Since it's an emotional topic, but did you start with that and then go back and
I think what prompted me was there was a family friend who was on the Swiss Air 111 flight that went down off of Nova Scotia, and for weeks afterwards, the family couldn't. They dredged the bottom of the sea for weeks after find body parts large enough to have a positive identification of who they were, and so I was kind of just haunted by this waiting period of where families from around the world, because it was a very international flight, literally went to this beautiful Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia and had this kind of vigil by the sea to wait, for the positive identification. So it was that juxtaposition of, the horror of mass death with the beauty of that landscape and the sea and that waiting period. So that was the initial, just that sort of image of, the ocean and the land always seemed to be a kind of border anyhow, and, all sorts of borders are transgressed there. So that's what started, and then afterwards I had to do the research and, went up to Nova Scotia and realized that I couldn't set my fictional world in the real place, but had to move it offshore to a fictional island in order to create my own little lifetime.
Please.
I had spoken with you earlier and asked you about the halcyon days that you had mentioned in the book. I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit.
I know in this reading it came up, the Kingfisher came up a couple of times, and the book is, essentially the entire book is a retelling of an ancient Greek myth, which we know as the Halcyon days. And to be brief, it's the story goes that Queen Alcyone and King Ceyx, who live on a place called Traches, brag of their perfect love that is better than Zeus's and Hera's, which is not a real good idea to do, to the Greek gods. Sure enough, the king goes off on a business trip on his boat, his ship, and Poseidon, or conspiring with some of the other gods, shipwreck him, and he dies, and his whole crew dies. And his body comes floating back to shore, and in the morning, Queen Alcyone sees her dead husband floating back to shore. In her grief, she throws herself into the sea. And at the last minute, the gods take pity on her, and they turn her into a bird, and they turn her dead husband into a bird, the Halcyons, which are kingfishers. Kingfisher is Greek. Halcyon is Greek for kingfisher. And they fly off. And the story goes that for 10 days in the winter, the Halcyons nest. The gods calm the sea so the Halcyons can nest there. And those are the Halcyon days. And so I always loved that story. When I first read it, probably in college, where our story of the Halcyon days come from. So I wanted to update that. I think a lot of the subtext of the book was, how can I tell that story in a contemporary setting? And so instead of a ship, it's a plane, and the birds they're both ornithologist characters. So that's kind of woven throughout. And if you're attuned to it, because it kept me interested in the book, is there's little things that writers do to stay awake. There's a lot of references to kingfishers and metamorphosis, because it's a story told in all of its metamorphosis. So.
Well, it's the Air Force that wrote in his wonderful account of the novel, The Essence of Storytelling, is the phrase that you used, and then. Events like this, the and then means that the author